really incorporate children's voice into everything we do, right? And so we're not just talking about them, we're talking with them, right? It's part of this, like, we recognize that they have an identity and they have needs and they have rights, and so bringing that into the conversation at all times. And I think that yoga and mindfulness has that power to do that as well.
It's June 11th, 2019, and welcome back to the Yoga Can podcast. I'm Lauren Sanders, your host. Today is a very special day because a few of you have requested an episode about kid yoga, and I found just the guest to bring it to you. Also, it's our second episode of the Mindfulness series. Last week, we traveled to Spokane, Washington, where we talked to the yoga teacher and sex therapist Jocelyn Rebar about mindfulness and sex.
So another piece too that I, talk about with my clients is, how are you defining sex, first of all, and how can we broaden that definition, right? So even for me, I help them like really broaden it. So not even just what's happening in that specific interaction, but, how are you, like your sex life, right? How are you talking with your partner? How are you, intimately connecting with them? How are you touching, even not in like a sexual way necessarily, but when you're cuddling, when you're hugging, holding hands, right? All of these things to really broaden, okay, this is what my sex life looks like. Right. And it's not just how often am I having penetrative sex with my partner, right? It's, how are we connecting?
In this week's episode, we are traveling to Liberty Lake, Washington to talk to Mary Ward Lupinacci, the owner of Be Still Kids and faculty of Children's Studies at Eastern Washington. In this episode, Mary will dip our toes into the world of kid yoga. She'll talk about the various ways to introduce yoga and mindfulness into the classroom and hurdles that currently exist when it comes to bringing mindfulness to schools. Now, some of you might be sitting there thinking, all right, Lauren, this episode's not for me. I don't have any kids. But I invite you to give it a listen anyways, because what Mary has done is she has taken her passion, her love for something, and turned it into a career. She's found entry points to bring yoga and mindfulness into the school setting. Her story is pretty amazing, and she also has reminded me about the importance to push back and to challenge the norms of society. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. The first 3 people to leave a review will get a shout out on social media, so please make sure to add your Instagram names. This podcast is just as much mine as it is yours. So if there is someone you know who would be a great guest for the podcast, or if you have a yoga-related question, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. You can always reach me via email, yogacan509@gmail.com, or through social media @yogacan. I cannot wait to hear from you. Now, for all of you Spokane yogis, I wanted to let you know that I picked up a few public classes for this week. I'll be teaching 3 classes at Harmony Yoga. On Wednesday, June 12th at 9 a.m., you'll find me teaching Vinyasa Flow. And then on Thursday, June 13th, you can find me teaching Vinyasa Flow at 10:45 and then Restorative Yoga at 4. Harmony Yoga is offering a great intro pass, 5 classes for $30. You can sign up for the classes on the MindBody app. I look forward to seeing you there. With that, please enjoy episode 13 of the Yoga Can podcast.
My name is Mary Ward Lupinacci. I am the owner of Be Still Kids, and I'm faculty in the Children's Studies program at Eastern Washington University. I grew up in Spokane and left for quite a while after I did my undergrad at Gonzaga, and left after that to do some work in the world, and ended up coming back to Spokane to do my graduate degree again at Gonzaga. So sort of the way that I like frame this for kids yoga and mindfulness, I started doing sort of therapeutic education work almost 20 years ago. While I was an undergrad at Gonzaga, I started working for Easter Seals of Washington, and really knew that therapeutic work was what I wanted to do, but I wanted to try doing that in a lot of different settings, in a lot of different ways. So after college, I moved to San Diego and did work as a behavior specialist at a middle school in El Cajon, California, and really loved it, and knew that I wanted to keep doing that work, but try it in more of like a learning-focused way. So I moved to Boston and got a job as a special education teacher at a nonprofit school for at-risk urban youth, which I'm doing like the finger quotes because that's really code for kids who had been pushed out of Boston public schools. So I did that work for quite a while, and it was while I was there that I started thinking about how to bring more therapeutic techniques into the learning space, because I was working with these kids who clearly had been through so much trauma, and in terms of like community violence and even violence in the schools they'd been in, right? Systemically and structurally and all these things. So I just knew like there's something I'm missing here, and I needed to be doing it a little different. At that time, I was doing a lot of my own yoga and meditation practice, and it was so transformative for me that I thought like I'm just gonna try this. And this is like in the early 2000s, so quite a long time ago. So I started just bringing little pieces in and not really having a plan for it, but just knowing that like maybe if we did some moving and some breathing in some intentional ways, then that might help a little bit, right? So, and the kids really responded to it. But I, like I was saying earlier, I think I sort of snuck it in here and there without really calling it anything, because I didn't know anybody that was doing that kind of work at the time.
In a way, did you feel like you were kind of breaking rules?
A little, yeah. I mean, thankfully, well, for better or worse, I've always worked in places with kids that are a little bit of alternative spaces, because I do have a tendency to push back against systems and institutions a little bit.
Me too.
Yeah, good. I think probably a lot of us in this yoga space are that way. So, so I would sort of like, it was kind of at that point, like whatever you could do in the classroom to make things go okay. And for me, what I really wanted to do in those kinds of spaces was make sure that my kids that I was working with were safe, and not just like physically safe, but like emotionally safe, and that they had the space to build their identities and get to know who they were and express that, right? So for me, I mean, yoga and mindfulness were those things. Those were the tools for us to be able to do that. And so I started to really sort of develop that. I think that's really neat too, because it correlates to maybe what you're learning on your yoga mat. Like your yoga mat was your safe space. Yeah. Your students didn't have a safe space, like a yoga mat or whatever that is. So you were cultivating that same sense in the classroom. Absolutely. And that was sort of always my goal. And however I was going to get there, it could look so many different ways. And so sometimes, when I talk about yoga on the mat and yoga off the mat, like a lot of us talk about, when I'm doing that with kids, it might look more like creative arts, or it might look more like something that's nature-based, right? And being outside and taking a walk. But when I teach kids those like principles of yoga, and then start to extend that out to like, we can do this kind of thing anywhere we're at, right? And I think that's the real opportunity we have teaching kids yoga, is that we start to not just talk about like the movement, right, and the body and the postures and all of that, but we're talking about like how to actually live from that place and in that really intentional way, in that really aligned and connected way. And kids really do understand that and want to engage in that and do it so naturally in so many spaces. So because they're already doing it. It's just now you're bringing more mindfulness to where it's coming from and why they're like where it's coming from within them, right? Instead of having it be maybe chaotic, they're like, oh, there's a reason why I'm expressing myself like this. Yeah, absolutely. What are some of the principles of yoga that you teach? So basically when I'm teaching kids yoga and mindfulness, I come at it from a place of teaching sort of the mindfulness piece first. So we do that in a way where we practice. I like to give kids pretty clear cues that they can take with them. So my whole goal is to be able to take this out into the world, right? To use it at school, to use it at home, to use it with friends, and all of these places where kids, it's scary to be a kid, right? And it's hard to be a kid, and kids don't have a lot of control in the world. And so just to give kids some tools for taking control of themselves and their emotions. So we come at it from a place of practicing paying attention and acting with intention. And those are the two pieces. So if I can teach those two things to kids and really have them begin to internalize what that feels like, right? So much of the time we tell kids to focus, right? Focus, pay attention, focus. But we don't actually show them what that feels like or let them practice what it feels like. We also know that that's different for every kid. So giving them a space to practice like, oh, this is what it feels like to really pay attention to something, rather than someone just telling me to pay attention and focus, right? Like I can feel it in my body. So we practice that sort of embodiment all the time of paying attention. And then acting with intention, so knowing that you get to respond if you're paying attention to your body, to what's going on around you, to what others are feeling, then you get to choose how you respond next. And it happens quickly, but we know for kids, if you teach it that way, they really do respond, right? And they really do start to make those kinds of connections. Rather than everything just being a reaction, they get to take some time to choose what's next.
Yeah, and they know that their response is going to be taken seriously.
Yes,
and it will be heard. Yeah, because you were talking about the lack of power that they have.
Yeah.
So after you incorporated some of these like more covert elements into the classroom of yoga when you were teaching in Boston, so it started working for you. Did you notice like change in your students' behavior, and like what did you notice?
And at that point, it was really it was just sort of me, like you're saying, like just noticing and feeling like I was really close with my students. So being able to feel their energy change, and you know that feeling, right? Like the energy in the room shifts.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times when we were doing some breathing or we were doing some like mindful movement, I wasn't calling it that at the time. I was just calling it like reach your arms up or whatever it was. Was really one of the only times during the day that I could get my students to stay in the classroom, and they would all stay. And I taught middle school, and so these were almost entirely middle school boys. And so to see that energy shift and to see that sort of engagement really felt like something, right?
Wow. Yeah. So they stayed, you mean physically? They
like
stayed
physically
in class?
stayed in the classroom.
Wow.
So this was the kind of school where like kids could just kind of, if they knew the ways to get out of the learning space, which was usually not a positive thing. So a lot of like blowouts, I guess you would call them, in the classroom. So for small amounts of time, I could get them to really engage, right? And I think it was so much about safety, because I think I've always said this, that I think most behaviors we see from kids are anxiety based. I think almost everything that we see, like we call it a meltdown or a tantrum or a blowout, whatever it is, whatever language we use for it, my experience has been that if you really go back to the root of it, almost all of those things are from some sort of anxiety, whether it's anxiety about whether they really are safe or what's going to happen next and not being able to predict that, or anxiety about not being able to communicate their needs, right? So allowing kids to feel that kind of safety in a real way, I think, is sort of at like the core of what we do. And I think that's why I was seeing that kind of reaction in the classroom too. Are
you still in touch with any of those students?
I am a little bit.
Oh,
yeah. I do have a couple of students that I talk to.
And where are they at now? Like, how are they doing?
They it's hit and miss. I have definitely lost some students along the way.
Wow.
And the students that I've kept in touch with, have definitely gone through some really difficult things, but they're grown-ups now, and they're working through it. Most of them in pretty healthy ways.
That's good.
Yeah. I always think about like reconnecting and talking more specifically about like those moments, right? Like those moments of breathing or moving or whatever it is that we were practicing, and seeing how they connected with that. I think that would be an interesting thing to do.
Yeah, it would be, if they incorporate any of that into their life now, or
right.
Who knows?
Yeah, who knows?
Yeah. So after Boston, then what grew from this?
So I knew that was, continuing to be the kind of work I wanted to do.
Okay.
But I really wanted to come back to Spokane. I just felt, my family's here, I just felt that pull. So I moved back to Spokane, and started I started a business doing in-home tutoring.
Okay.
And was using these kinds of principles too. So I would go into people's homes, and, so much of the time when you're seeing a learning issue with kids, there's something more, right? There's something that is behavioral, or something that is more about like comfort and safety or confidence, or all of those things. So I did start to do some of the mindfulness work specifically in the way that I was tutoring. And I decided from there that I wanted to go back and do graduate school. So I went to Gonzaga and did a master's degree in both school counseling and community counseling. And during that time really started to focus more on this alignment piece, right? That like, I don't want to do counseling with kids that doesn't incorporate some sort of like emphasis on the body and the mind and the emotion and the way that those things are in balance. And what I was finding with traditional counseling is that there wasn't a lot of space for that. Yeah. Even in play therapy, I mean, it was more about, watching kids, observing kids play and interpreting play, and kids being able to use that as an outlet, but not really focusing any energy on like, what does it feel like in your body when you play, right? So to me, that embodiment piece was so important. So at that time I started really looking more closely at the work that was being done at the Samaria Center in Seattle with Molly Kenny. And they were doing work there called integrated movement therapy. So I started sort of studying that, and studied with them as much as I could while I was in my master's degree program, and really knew like I needed to incorporate both things. So started looking more at yoga therapy and how to really use those principles with kids. So I just sort of naturally began that work in my counseling practice, and then went from there to do my PhD work at Washington State University. And while I was at Washington State, I focused on teaching in the teacher education program and special education program, but really focused on inclusion and what that means. And to me, inclusion also meant these like practices of embodiment. So I've just recently finished my PhD.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
That's a big deal.
It's a big deal, and it was a long process.
How long was it?
It took me 10 years.
Wow. Seriously?
But I did take some time in that. So I had both my daughters during that time, and did a lot of other things. Started this
a business
organization, and got a faculty position and all of those things.
Right.
So I did it a little bit non-traditionally, like those things that I do. So yeah, it did take 10 years, but totally worth it. So my dissertation research is about mindfulness curriculums that are used in schools, and looking at the ways that those sorts of discourses that are used in schools are inclusive or possibly not. So that's sort of the foundation for all of the work that I do, is thinking about how we use practices like yoga and mindfulness to really create inclusive environments for kids.
Do you think the inclusive part came from your background or the students that you were teaching before you started your master's and PhD, like when you were working with the kids in Boston and in LA?
Yeah, to me it just felt like all of it was so connected, and it all just sort of built upon each thing that I was doing. I could see like this, it may not have looked like a linear path, but it definitely was all sort of building upon each thing as I went. And so yes, like that beginning foundation of teaching in environments that, you know, part of the reason I knew I wanted to continue on to a master's and a doctoral program is because there's just so much systemically and structurally that I knew was not good for the kids I was working with, right? And so finding some entry points to sort of shift that and push back on those kinds of systems was really important.
Yeah.
But then finding the ways to do that directly with kids, right? But then also in sort of a bigger picture way in terms of the research I do on inclusion, the writing I do on inclusion, all of those things.
So what were you pushing back on then?
So, you know, a lot of, I think most of us who practice yoga probably have this sort of feeling that some of the ways that we do things like school are kind of like counterintuitive to what we know our bodies really need, right? So if we're asking kids, especially for kids, so if we're asking kids to sit at their desks and take tests for several hours a day, we know then that we're ignoring some of these other really important needs, right? Like emotional balance and connection, and like community building, and like the actual physical movement activity that we know that kids need, right?
Yeah.
So I think I always was recognizing just this imbalance, right? And you can feel it in schools.
I used to actually like get out of school.
Yeah.
I would pretend I was sick. I remember I used
too.
to pretend I was sick all the time. And it was once, because I was in a great kindergarten, first grade, second grade class. This teacher, Mrs. Austin, her classroom was actually set up very much like your studio.
Yeah.
So really neat stuff hanging from the ceiling that we made. The lights were dimmer, very hands-on. So many. We would do a lot of field trips, and we also did a lot of hands-on projects, and it just served my mind. That's how I am. Looking back on it, I think I would have excelled in a Montessori school.
Right.
And so as I got older, though, like third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, even sixth grade, I would just fake sick. Like I would go to the nurse's office and just be sick because I don't know if I was getting overstimulated or what, but I would even be in a classroom where it was all white and like the lights were on. I'm like, my eyes are hurting. Like I can't see the board. Like I was just getting so tired. And so looking back, I definitely did ways where I pushed back in my own way in the classroom.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just see that there's a lot of space for there to be growth.
Yes.
Even in a class that isn't what some would call, even like in a traditional school setting, you know, you don't have to like change up everything, but a few things.
Exactly what you're talking about. So if we're thinking about like, you're describing your own pushback, right? And this sort of individual pushback that you figured out a way to do, and you didn't know you were doing it. But I think, you know, a lot of times that pushback that we see is what we then label behavior in kids. And when we see behaviors, then we like go immediately to intervention.
Right.
And that is sort of this individualized response to an issue that's really more systemic, right? So part of what I think we get the opportunity to do with kids yoga and mindfulness is teach skills on an individual level, but then also like start to find those entry points in like the systems, right, where we can do things a little differently. So so for instance, like when I'm teaching kids yoga and mindfulness, the first thing that we teach kids is this idea of like what do you need, right? And we start to really think about like what does your body need, And for a lot of kids, that is not something that is explored often, right? And so in order to do that, that's where like the yoga piece comes in, right? Where they really get to start moving and connecting to their bodies and figuring out like when I feel that sort of discomfort or that feeling like you were experiencing at school, right? Like I got to get out of here.
Yeah.
Where's that coming from? Where is it in your body? And then we give kids some tools through yoga to really address those specific kinds of discomforts, right? And so it's not just saying like, what do you need? It's recognizing what you need, right, in your body, but then also being able to express it, right? And
so do you give them tools to express it with their voice, or maybe they try something on their own?
so we'll start with like let's do both things.
Okay.
So like with everything. So I think this is also one of those places where we get to practice balance and really emphasize it and teach kids what it means. So with everything that I do with kids, I offer a couple of like, okay, you're going to practice it on your own. What do you know you need? Is it a deep breath? Is it a movement? Is it some sort of visualization? What is it that's going to get that need met for you, that you have control of? And then also, how can you ask for help, right? So a lot of that, like, that's the balance, right? So we do it on our own, and then we also have a community that we know we can turn to and ask for what we need. And so when I'm working in schools, that's sort of the goal too, right? Is to say like, now we all have this language and we recognize each other's needs, we honor each other's needs, and we then feel safe to communicate our needs, right? And you can teach that from such an early age.
Yeah, and where I see this being huge is as this group of people begin to grow and that awareness continues to trickle out, we're going to see shifts in our society where people are more open to talking about their needs and getting resources from the community to support them. So it could help with like mental health, even just on a low scale or really extreme scale of mental health. And so what are some of these, so you say that you work with schools, what are some like entry points that you are starting to see that you can begin to introduce this in?
Yeah, so I think there's a real trend, and you know, the research, there's more and more research on using kids yoga and mindfulness in schools and for learning and for behavior and all of those things. So I think that people now have more of a connection to, you know, particularly mindfulness in schools and mindful learning. So I think as that sort of opens up, people begin to understand a little bit differently what that means. And there's so many accessible tools for teachers and for schools to use right now. So I think that the more we're sort of getting it out there and talking about it and allowing people to see what it looks like to do yoga and mindfulness with kids and why it's important for learning, I think that it becomes, you know, so much easier to do. So I think one of the entry points really that continues to be one that people come to me and ask about is this idea of kids feeling really scared in schools, right? So
Scared why?
well, I've got like all the kids that we work with and all the kids that go to public schools at this point, at least in our area, are having to practice like lockdown drills.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And so I think that, and anytime that happens, I have parents come to me and the kids come to me and say, we had this lockdown drill today. It was really scary and intense, and I need to like practice some skills to get through that when that happens, right? So it's just sort of, at this point, sadly, like an inevitable piece of what happens in schools. We have kids really having to think about how to protect themselves in schools and how to stay safe. And so I think that becomes an entry point because you see everybody's sort of on the same page, right? Like parents want their kids to have an outlet for staying calm, right? And for processing those kind of big fears and emotions that come with that. Teachers want some tools to say like, I know this is really scary. It's scary for all of us. Let's like breathe through it, right? And like, really stay okay, right? So I think finding those kinds of like common experiences that feel really important, right? This one
Right.
feels big. Like this feels like one of those things that people really organize around. And so when we know that we have at our disposal tools like breathing or visualization, right, that everybody can use and everybody can access, and you don't need equipment, and you don't need, like, you can just use it when your body needs it.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are the kinds of tools that teachers are really looking for.
Okay. And it's neat that you're in a way, what you're also doing is you're teaching parents how to practice mindfulness.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And the teachers to practice mindfulness on their own, because it all starts from the adults.
Absolutely.
Teaching. I mean, and the kids are first of all teaching us that, because we're becoming more aware of how to better serve them so that they feel safe in the classroom.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of neat that it's actually beginning to hit everybody, not just kids.
Yeah.
Kid yoga isn't just for kids.
It isn't, right? It isn't. And I think those really basic principles of kids yoga, and I do kids yoga and mindfulness always together, because to me there's just, if we're promoting that idea of balance between mind, body, and emotion, then we do both of those things always together.
Yeah.
And I think also that's another entry point, so we call it both of those things so that it really connects with more people, right? Because we know, like, yoga can be something that does feel exclusionary to some people, right? Even though we know, like, if you're practicing inclusive yoga, it really is inclusive to all think and all learners, right? But by saying that we're doing both things and really showing the model for doing both of those things, I think we have a better chance of connecting with people.
Yeah.
And I have so many parents that will come to me and say, like, my kid came home and showed me how to do deep breathing and got into child's pose before bed. And it's just this, like,
that's so sweet.
They've got a couple of tools now that they can use, and sometimes that's all we really need, right?
Yeah, it is. And when it comes back to the inclusion piece that you were talking about, that really resonates for me because of my sister Ellie, who has Down syndrome. And also I went through the yoga accessibility training. Yeah. And one thing that they, from like a studio perspective, one thing that they had me become more aware of is who isn't in your classroom.
Right. Yep.
You know, so yoga does have this exclusion factor where you think it's just for, like, you know, this particular body type. But I like how you include, like, you really emphasize body and mind, because it's opening up the door for a lot of different people to roll in here.
Yes.
To experience yoga. So it could be deep breathing, which is body. Yeah. And then your mind. And so anyone can do deep breathing.
Yes.
So it's not just for, you know, able body. It can be for, like, any kind of body, or even mental capacity. Like my sister Ellen, what I've started, so before my yoga accessibility training, I wanted to find a way to bring yoga to her, but I just couldn't, because my 200-hour training was more focused on, like, able bodies. Yes. Which was great. We had a big gentle yoga, which was really cool. Our gentle yoga, a lot of our training was geared around gentle yoga. So I got aware of how to bring it to different, you know, populations, but like older, you know, demographics and stuff. But this accessibility yoga, it, like, opened up my eyes. And these women are a lot like you who led the training. They are both from the field of, like, therapy and counseling. And one of the teachers, she said, I'm like, how can I bring this to my sister? She is nonverbal. She, you know, can be extremely obstinate, like, all of these things. Yeah. And so she's like, have you ever just held her and did hum pranayama? Yeah. And I was like, no, I never thought of that. So now I hug Ellen and I do the hum pranayama with her. And for the listeners out there, hum pranayama is basically the hum sound, like, and it vibrates your lips, your throat, your chest. And Ellen, when I hold her, she can feel that. And so now she'll do it with me when I hug her. And it's now when we're together, we do like 15 minutes of kind of twisting, different unique movements. So it's been neat to find ways to bridge yoga to her. And that's just one way on how, I'm bringing yoga to my sister. And it's just been kind of fun to introduce it to her because it's accessible to her.
Yes.
Even though we're not doing like down dog, we're doing like we're taking elements from the principle of yoga into our time together.
Right.
And it's been cool to connect with her on that level.
Oh, it's so good.
Yeah, it's neat.
Because when you think about, right, when, we talk about like special needs, right?
Mm-hmm.
When people have different sensory needs, which, a lot of people who have different abilities really do experience different kinds of sensory needs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yoga and mindfulness is one of those practices where you can really create all kinds of different sensory inputs for people. So that humming vibration, right? That sound can be so soothing for people who have differing sensory needs. And so when we're teaching kids yoga and mindfulness, we spend a lot of time really focusing on senses and how to use them, right? So how to notice, not just with our eyes, but with our ears, with our smell, right? With our voice, we notice with our hands. So really starting to and that's part of teaching that idea of paying attention. So paying attention isn't just like sitting in a class and watching your teacher. Paying attention is also like, what do you feel, right? What do you feel with your fingers? What kind of taste is there? What do things smell like, right? Like, what do you hear right now? So we can really start to practice those things, and that's where we get that, like, what are our differing sensory needs, and you can start to develop things that really work for different kinds of kids, right? And grown-ups, really.
Yeah.
And so you see these, like, really, like you're talking about, really accessible entry points. And I think using something like yoga as that entry point, like that really does give us the capacity for creating inclusive kinds of environments, and that's what yoga should be.
Yeah.
That's what we want it to be, right?
So sometimes also when I think of yoga and inclusion, I think about people with different like religious beliefs seeing yoga as being, an Eastern religion. And so have you gotten into any of that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is a question I get a lot.
Oh, really? Cool.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Because I work in schools, and because we also, so I have a teaching partner who's in North Carolina. Her name's Kelly Fagan. She is from Dreamcatcher, Kids Yoga and Mindfulness Studio. And her and I have, we do teacher trainings and kids yoga and mindfulness trainings sort of all over the world. And this is something we get all the time. So, like, what do? We have a bunch of parents in this district who are not going to be on board with us saying we're doing yoga or anything like meditative in our classrooms, right? So one way that we sort of work around that is to just call it something different, right? So we will sometimes just say, like, this is movement and breathing. Okay. And everybody moves and everybody breathes, right? So we take some of that language out of it, but still really like use the same kinds of principles. We just might not call them the same thing. And again, like, so with the kids that come to my studio, we focus a lot on the 8 limbs of yoga, and we have sort of a child-friendly way that we do that. We have a little model that they use. But if I was doing that in a school, I might not use that same model because there may be some parents who don't really feel comfortable or understand what we're doing, right? So, but it's always for me one of the hardest things because I'm always in conflict with it. So part of my dissertation research really looked at like the mindfulness curriculum that's being used in schools really takes that Eastern traditional language out. So in all the curriculums I looked at, there were only a couple of times that the word meditation was ever even used. even though they were doing very traditional kinds of meditations, right? So I do sort of struggle with this idea of like, are we taking some of that that really deep cultural value away when we do that? And sort of like, is it okay to do that? Like, what is the benefit, right? So we want kids to have these tools, right? We really do. So if it means sometimes, changing our language a little bit, but still teaching those practices, I think it's okay to do that.
I get your conflict though, because
always, yeah.
In the yoga accessibility training, that was one of the first things that they brought up was adjusting your dialogue according to your audience, and especially in schools. And you know me, a pusher, I raise my hand. I'm like, isn't this totally going against what yoga is?
Yeah.
And in a way, aren't we doing them a disservice because we're not explaining the origin? And these teachers were fabulous. They just said, in essence, like that, there's truth in that. But at the same time, though, as a yoga teacher, your responsibility is to meet your students where they're at.
Right.
So every student, they might not be able to hear really actually the word meditation, but they're able to hear the word mindful or awareness or self-awareness. And eventually, over time, they'll begin to become more, they'll be in the headspace to receive that word.
Yes.
But it doesn't happen overnight, because that's just how we are as humans.
Yeah.
It takes time for us to get comfortable with things, and they might not meet the word meditation with you as their teacher. It might be another teacher down the road.
Right.
So it's just kind of meeting your student where they're at and honoring their space, because that's really what matters, is how they feel it in their body and in their mind. And if as a yoga teacher, our responsibility is to keep people safe, that's a way of doing it, is just keeping them safe with like what they hear and how they connect to it.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. I do sometimes think, like, aren't we like lying though?
No, I know. I actually wrote about this in some of my research. Yeah, I'll share it with you. So
that'd be awesome.
So I really thinking about, I call them discourses of exclusion in schools. So what are the ways we talk about things or organize things in schools that create exclusion? And this can kind of become one of those points. So to me, if we're practicing like a really traditional form of meditation in our mindfulness curriculum, but we're not calling it that, to me it's a missed opportunity to do some really expansive cultural work.
Totally.
Right?
I never
You could
thought
talk
of it
about
like
the
that.
history, right? You could use it as an opportunity to practice practice different cultures and to really honor that. And so to me, that's, again, one of those points where we could be doing this in a way that was even more inclusive, right? And even more rich and deep. So I think we'll continue to sort of struggle with that.
Okay. Do you see any success stories of this? So in your dissertation, you said that you did see like a handful of schools or places that were using the yoga terms. Yeah. How was that? How did they get to that place?
Yeah, I think that I think my experience and research I've done has been pretty limited on that. I think we're just starting to see some of that come about.
Okay.
So it will be interesting to sort of keep an eye on that and see, the direction that takes. I think, again, so it gets it's all complicated, right? So then what we don't want to do is make it so that, we've completely, we've sort of colonized yoga and now it's in our public schools, and that changes the meaning of it too, right? Because to me, that's one of the tensions also, is that if you're really practicing yoga, right? So, and this is something we talk about all the time in kids yoga, we're practicing non-competition. We're practicing things that are not based on evaluation and performance, right? And schools are really designed for evaluation and testing and performance and achievement and inherently competitive, right? Kids are are constantly put in positions to compete with each other. That's how you achieve in school.
Yeah.
So is that, like, does that even work, right? There's that real contradiction between, like, what we teach in yoga and how schools are actually designed. So again, one of those really, like, tense areas of, like, how are we finding the balance of this? And what does it mean for yoga if we bring it into schools where we know we're still practicing these, like, really contradictory things, right? So that's sort of that, like, constant, like, it's not an easy thing to do, and we'll constantly sort of work through it. But I think for me, I always sort of go back to this idea of balance, right? So maybe it's about, like, you know, we're putting some of this into the school day so that kids experience that feeling of balance, so that, you know, possibly as they move forward, they think about the times where, like, what it feels like to not be in competition with other kids, right? They think about the times when they're not just performing to be evaluated, right?
Yeah.
But they're really doing something for their own bodies, for their own emotions, for their own minds, right? So,
right.
So to me, at this point, it's really about that balance.
Yeah.
And the value of that.
And maybe by beginning to shift their minds around when they are in a time of performance. So they're giving a presentation that's based on an evaluation.
Right.
Their approach might actually come from a place of mindfulness. So what they're presenting is actually more authentic to them.
Exactly.
And so as they get older, they're going to start to find themselves in spaces where naturally they're going to need to quote unquote compete or present, but for them it's not that. For them it's like I really am passionate about this. Like, this is my heart. Doesn't really matter, you know, what my grade is or if I get the promotion, but this is, like, my truth.
Yes.
And if we're instilling that in kids to become more comfortable in those situations that are seen as competition, it might begin to expand, like, what people share. So it's not based on a level of threat, like, if you don't get this right, you'll lose. It's more going to become, like, real innovation or real solutions are going to be presented to eventually, like, their bosses or managers, instead of having, like, the same cookie cutter response. Like, they're going to start to provide more true solutions that are unique, which actually might help the growth of, like, our society, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, because that's where we're kind of getting at. Like, you kind of see, like, these kids talk about climate change. Like, their approach to it is a lot more passionate than we've ever seen from that age group. Like, this age group of, like, 14, 13, 12-year-olds, like, they are, and even with the gun, like, with all the gun rights stuff going on, they are taking up a lot of space in voicing. And it's got to come from this element of, like, taking away that competition, not worrying about their response, and be like, this is my truth.
Yes.
So no, you're empowering, like, these kids to get there, which is so cool.
I think that, I mean, it sounds so idealistic, right?
It does.
It does. But I think that, I mean, I talk about this all the time, like, it is sort of that. Like, it sounds idealistic, but also this is the way that shifts in culture happen.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be a massive change like climate change or gun law, but it could be, you know, something as small as just, you know, a new approach to handling a difficult business partner.
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
like, just, or even,
or relationships.
Or your wife or partner. Yeah. Right. I mean, there's so many little ways that day-to-day life.
Right, and even your own stress, right? So we know, like, kids are faced with a really extreme amount of stress and pressure, and so just to even have a set of coping skills, as, like, imagine, like, learning that from such a young age and carrying it with you as you change and as you grow and you face new situations, and, like you're saying, in a really authentic way, recognizing what you need and how you connect to people and how you connect to yourself, and then taking that with you throughout your life, so that when you are in these high stress situations or those times of like personal chaos or even like cultural chaos, right? Like, you have a healthier response.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the like individual goals, but then that really does transfer into our communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then big picture into our culture, because
Mm-hmm.
that's the way that we start to sort of shift the way that
Yeah.
we engage with each other, the way we understand each other.
And in the school system, like the school system eventually might begin to shift into out of that, you know, out of the state of what were you saying? You're saying it was like 3 things. It's like, you know, competition, results, evaluation. So it might begin to shift that whole look at that system
Right.
into something a little bit more, just less that.
Right. Well, and I think, I mean, earlier you asked about entry points, and I think
Mm-hmm.
one of the other big entry points, especially in schools right now, is this like, you know, this culture of standardized testing.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got like a lot of kids, a lot of teachers, a lot of parents who are saying like, we know that this is not the best thing for our kids, right? We know that we're sending them to schools and we're putting this pressure on them to perform and be evaluated, and we're teaching to these tests, and
Right.
like, it doesn't feel good, right? Like there are not a lot of people who are like, yes, standardized testing is the best, right? But we're in it and we do it, and so what we end up seeing is people, teachers especially, reaching out and saying like, I need some support here. Like what tools can I give my students, because I know they have to do this, but you can feel the tension and the stress in the room, right?
Yeah.
So what are the tools I can use? Yoga and mindfulness, right? It's a really easy entry point into saying like, here's some stress management tools, here's some ways to stay calm, here's some ways to handle that kind of stress that comes, and then from there, that becomes the entry point, right? So then the conversation changes a little bit from like, yes, this is like your evaluation and your test, but also like what are you feeling, and like how can we shift that like competitive, like I have to get the best test scores, to something that's a little more authentic.
Right.
I work with obviously at Eastern I teach undergrads right now, and they have all grown up in this like culture of standardized testing, and I get them in my classroom, and I actually teach a mindfulness class there. It's mindfulness and alternative practices for working with kids, and it's a core required course, so all of our students who are going to go out and work directly with kids in all kinds of different settings, they all get this class, and they all get these tools. Yeah. So, and they love it. I mean, the response is just like, oh, they get it for themselves, right? They get to practice it, but then they also learn how to really do this kind of work with kids.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, and they're going out to work, you know, in the hospitals and foster care and social services and classrooms, all of these different settings. So, so I think, you know, like we've talked about, that movement is growing. But when I start to introduce things to my undergrads, things like, you know, these concepts like mindfulness, or maybe asking them to be a little bit more authentic in the classroom, a little creative, right? They really sometimes struggle, and I kind of leave things open-ended, and they'll say to me, hey, like, you need to remember, like, we grew up in an era where there were very specific directions, and there was one answer, and like, this is how we know how to do school. And so we have to really sort of relearn how to think creatively and how to engage with each other in the classroom, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, and they all can really point to their experiences in schools and the way that they, like, I have some students who say, like, I don't contribute out loud in class because I get worried that I'm being evaluated on that. And so, because I've always just been evaluated all through school, right? So
that's wild.
there's a lot of like unlearning and then
Right.
relearning of like this authentic learning contribution, right? So
because if you've been suppressing your responses for so long in the classroom,
you forget how to do
you forget how to, like,
Yeah.
and you just kind of go into like autopilot. Or I'm glad you shared that with me, because now that is where people do come from, is being evaluated. Like, does this pose look right?
Yeah.
It's like, well, how do you feel in it?
Right.
You know, does it feel right for your body?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so. What I'm really curious about with you is, where did you ever get yoga teacher training? Where is this coming from? Have you just been a student forever?
No. So,
Okay.
I have my kids yoga certification
Yeah.
from Schooled, and which is a really great training if you're looking to do kids yoga. There's online options and some in-person things, but I also do have a 200-hour
Oh, right on.
yoga teacher training. I can be kind of critical of yoga just in general in the US, so I don't actually always say where it's from because it was really an awful experience.
Oh.
And one of those, when we talk about like the commodification of yoga, and it was presented to me as being one thing, and then it really ended up being something very different. That was like a real packaged, like just complete these like worksheets and then we're good. So it wasn't a great experience.
Talk about standardization.
Exactly.
Yeah, and you wouldn't even, I would not expect that in yoga training.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's something we need to think about too in the yoga world is like the way that we are sort of marketing and selling and packaging our teacher trainings and even our classes, right? So it's so much about selling yoga, and so I think and kids yoga is sort of moving in that direction as well. There are like an abundance of kids yoga teacher trainings now. The market is kind of saturated on that. There are products and studios, like they do a lot of selling of merchandise and things like that. I think we need to be really mindful of what that means. I mean, especially for kids, we are already, kids are really bought and sold to all the time, right? Like things are packaged and marketed to kids. And so to me, it's really important, like in our yoga space, you'll see here, I want this to be a space where parents can come and don't feel like they have to buy something, right? All of our classes are donation-based. So we have a suggested donation fee of $10 an hour, but nobody's ever turned away. So, and that's a model that's really worked for us.
Wow.
Because we also are building community. So we want, there are some times when families will say, like, I've got some extra money to give to the studio this month, and like I'd like to put that into the community fund. And so then for a family who maybe this month can't really afford to come, we know we've got some extra money for them, right?
That's neat.
And people just sort of give and take when they can, and we share that with each other. So that's a really important piece of that inclusion that I talk about too, is finding some ways, and that might, I know that studios have to stay in business and that's important, but I think it's also important for us to be really thoughtful in the ways that we're like making these spaces accessible to people, right?
Yeah.
So that's part of what we do.
Yeah, is B still a nonprofit?
So we don't have nonprofit status.
Okay.
No. We're a community organization and donation based.
Neat.
Yeah.
When you were, so then Kelly or is it Kelly or Molly?
My teaching partner?
Yeah, Kelly Fagan.
Yeah.
So does she have a similar model over in North Carolina?
She has a similar model.
Okay.
Not donation based necessarily, but does have the community fund and does really practice not turning people away. We both really come from a place of wanting, anybody that wants to access this space can. And so we keep our costs low, right? So that might mean that, so one thing we talk about a lot with kids yoga is that there are all of these sort of, these spaces where kids yoga is starting to emerge, right? Like in yoga studios, in schools, all of these things. And what ends up happening when we're talking about inclusive yoga is that we've noticed this trend. Kids yoga studios are creating specialized classes for their special needs kids.
Yeah.
And that's something that we have really committed to not doing in our programs, because all of our groups are inclusive. So anybody can come at any time, right? Like even the age limits we use, they're just sort of like a guide. So we can find a way to adapt this space for anybody that comes here. And what ends up happening,
cool.
Well, so what we've noticed, and one thing we try to be really vocal about, is that a lot of the times when studios are offering yoga for special needs,
Mm-hmm.
they're also charging more for those classes.
Okay.
And like, what could be more exclusionary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like to charge more because like your children may need more like modifications or adaptations. That's really, to me, a bad practice.
Yeah.
And we'll see studios say like, well, it's because we have to have another person in here. And so what Kelly and I both always try to promote is that like there's ways to be creative and like get some volunteers, get some people in, like people in the community want to come do this work, right? So if
Definitely.
you need extra people in the room,
Yeah.
have volunteers come in, right? You don't charge families extra to like bring their children with different movement needs into a yoga studio.
Because just speaking from what my parents have shared with me about Ellie is now she's in her early 20s and it's just expensive.
It's expensive.
And it's tough to get certain kind of social security and benefits. And then if there's this great studio that is really easy to get to because you don't need to have insurance.
Right.
And then you have to pay like extra. I mean, it's just kind of an extra way of suppressing that whole experience and
it's
relationship.
Just one more barrier.
Yeah. So what I hear you're saying is that this studio is a legit just yoga studio.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're just a yoga space for kids.
Yeah.
To come and do yoga
and learn it and practice it in the ways that are right for them.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's really, really neat that you do that, and Kelly as well. Yeah, I never thought of it or even knew that was kind of a thing. There's charging more.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, and so that's a practice to sort of look for and one that we really...
Oh, yeah, it's a good way for parents to become more mindful of the studio that they'll go to for kid yoga is like look at how their price structure, look at who they're charging and stuff.
Yeah, and I work with a lot of studios too who are... grown-up yoga studios who are like building their kids yoga programs, and I do a lot of trainings for some of those studios, and they don't really, it's not like it's malicious, right? Like nobody's meaning to do harm. It's just something they probably haven't thought a lot about, and so we make sure to make that part of the way that we teach too, to say like, what are the things you can do to make this really accessible for as many families as possible, because that's really the goal.
Yeah, that's neat. So are you looking for volunteers here? Like how can people connect with you to volunteer in this space?
So we welcome community members in all the time. So people can get in touch with me. So a really good way to stay sort of up to date with everything we do is through Instagram. Everything's on Instagram at Be Still Kids, and our website is bestillkids.com, so all of my contact information, all of our programs are there. Okay, that's cool. And so kind of winding down a little bit from our awesome conversation, I would love to talk to you more though about your dissertation, because that seems like we could unpack that for a while. Oh yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah, so much there. So I like to ask my guests a few questions. Okay. So one of my questions to start you off is what does yoga mean to you?
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
Yoga to me means being in balance with mind, body, and emotion, and really connecting with a purpose.
Cool. And when you say emotion, are you also referring to spirit as well?
Yeah, okay. I am. Yeah. So the way that, and I do that in a really intentional way. So, in traditional yoga, especially for adults, right? We talk about the body and the mind and the spirit. I do sort of use that emotion language because I'm working with kids, and because I think this is a space to really practice emotion and connection to emotion and the harmony of all three of those things. So I do change that language a little bit with kids, but it's all sort of getting at the same thing. Right?
Yeah, it is. And I forgot to ask you this. Are there any schools in this district or in Spokane or Idaho or surrounding areas that you have taught or offered, guidance to with yoga and mindfulness?
Yeah, there are lots of schools in the Spokane district that are having these kinds of programming sort of emerge. I work pretty closely with school counselors, so
Okay, cool.
There are a lot of school counselors in the area. A lot of the kids that we work with are coming from Spokane Public Montessori School,
Okay.
which is really close by here, and a community that's really open to this work. I do a lot of work with Wilson Elementary School on the South Hill. And then there are a lot of counselors who are really just doing this work in their own way. And a lot of teachers that I work with who are incorporating, yoga breaks or mindfulness breaks throughout the day. Kind of all over the place.
That's
really
neat.
Yeah.
So is that who you see in your training then? A lot of teachers and counselors?
In our trainings, we really do. So Kelly, my teaching partner, is a former special education teacher as well.
Cool.
So we do see a lot of teachers, a lot of counselors, social workers, people in the health field who are looking to do, like people in occupational therapy or physical therapy who just want to build their skill set with kids. We also have a lot of parents that take the training just to have another set of skills at home.
Yeah. I could see this being really helpful being a parent.
Yeah.
Because you tap into your own mindfulness.
Yes.
And that you get brought down into your window of tolerance. And then you can respond to your child who's having a tantrum or a meltdown or whatever it is, or not listening.
Yeah.
So you're coming at them from a place of like respect and centeredness, so you don't lose it on them.
Yeah, and it's more intuitive. It's not like a book to read, right?
Yeah.
Which a lot of parents do, and obviously that's great. But this is also sort of building our own intuition in the way that we parent and interact with our kids, right? Which is so important.
Yeah, it's just another tool in that toolbox because you need them as a parent.
Yeah, exactly. And anybody really working with kids, I mean.
Yeah.
It's really important to just have as much information as you can.
Yeah, because it again breaks away from that standardization. Like every kid's the same. It's like no, every kid is different.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting because it's like that sense of identity kind of comes like once you get into college.
Right.
But it's like, so before then, what were you?
Yeah, right. Well, we talk in children's studies, we talk about this all the time.
Oh, really? Cool.
Kids are really, we have this idea that like we make decisions for kids and about kids and we plan for kids and about them. And in my field in children's studies, we really look at like how do we incorporate children's voice into everything we do, right? And so we're not just talking about them, we're talking with them, right? It's part of this, like we recognize that they have an identity and they have needs and they have rights, and so bringing that into the conversation at all times. And I think that yoga and mindfulness has that power to do that as well.
That's interesting you brought that up because as a family, like my family of origin, I'm the oldest of 5, and then it goes Will, who's 29, and then my sister Maddie, who's 22, Ellen, the one with Downs, who's 20, and then James is 14. Yeah. And so what we were doing, and my mom and dad, and so what we were doing and not really noticing it is like we were talking for Ellen.
Yeah.
So someone would ask Ellen a question, but not really her a question. Like we would ask my mom or James or my dad. And so what my mom is wanting us to become more mindful of is looking at Ellen, asking her, not speaking for her, and then in a conversation setting, even like how we're set up. So we're not cutting Ellie out of the circle or out of the group. Like we leave her space to come in because she's kind of like a shy horse.
Right.
Like she'll come in and then she'll leave the conversation. Right. So we just we create space for her to always kind of have an entry point.
Yes.
And it's made a huge difference. Like this past year, she's just blossomed and expanded.
Isn't it amazing? Yeah.
And it's a part of that could be because we're adding her into the conversation instead of talking around her.
Right.
So it's been kind of cool.
Yeah. And sometimes to do that kind of inclusion, we really do have to intentionally create those spaces.
Because it's hard.
It's hard.
It's like, it's super easy to talk and think for Ellie, but I mean, think about it. She's 20.
Right.
Like, she has an identity.
Yeah.
But it's hard for her to express it. So it's just hard. It would be so much easier just to do and think for her.
Of course.
But instead, it's like, yeah, it's just intentionally like doing that. And it is a lot of work, but we're noticing the benefits. So
that's amazing.
Yeah. So as kids, though, or kids with special needs, if that starts at a younger age, it can just foster a lot more connection in the family and connection to the self as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so last question. So where do you live? Liberty Lake or Spokane?
We live in Liberty Lake.
Okay.
So we actually have a studio in the North Monroe district.
Oh, sweet. Okay.
Yeah, and we have one in Liberty Lake. Our Liberty Lake studio is more of a private studio, and we do a lot of our learning, like mindful learning there as well. We have a little classroom there too. So, but we get to do a lot of nature work there because we're at the lake, like literally at the lake. So we have a little beach spot, and so a lot of our summer programs are in Liberty Lake.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So where is one place or two in Liberty Lake? You're my first Liberty Lake guest.
Oh, fun.
So that someone should visit or go see or eat for a restaurant.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I love this question. Okay. So if you are in Liberty Lake, everything's beautiful, but the regional park in Liberty Lake, if you have not done the park or a hike out there, it is so worth it. There's a 7-mile loop, and actually at the top of the loop there's a waterfall, and it's really beautiful.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's
wow.
It's one of my favorite hikes, and it's on the lake, and the views are beautiful, so that's one thing to do.
I've never heard of this.
You haven't?
No.
Oh, yeah. So it's at the Liberty Lake Regional Park. So you can, do part of it or do the whole thing. It's a really good family activity also. And then, let's see, there are actually really good restaurants in Liberty Lake.
Yeah.
That don't probably get enough attention. So,
what do you think? What are some?
So, let's see. Cork House is a really good restaurant, really good bar there too. And then Piccolo's is a little pizza place that is also connected to a restaurant called Hey J's, but it's also in the same sort of like little strip mall as a gas station. So
I've heard of that place.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's really good. And a really good happy hour.
Nice. Love that.
Worth the trip to Liberty Lake.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Now, so summer's coming up. Do you have any workshops going on this summer that people can get in on?
Yeah, so our kids programming, we have a Thursday group in Liberty Lake, a Friday sort of mini camp in our North Monroe studio. We have our Soul Girls, which is our girls group that we run on Tuesdays, and the counterpart to that is Ohm Boys, our boys groups. So that's the only group we do that sort of separates out like that. And those are inclusive groups. So that's for anybody who identifies as a girl or identifies as a boy is welcome in those groups. And then, so for kids, that's sort of what we have going on in the summer. I do a lot of one-on-one sessions that are therapeutic sessions with kids. So in the summer, I have more availability for that as well. And people can just contact me for more information about that. We're doing I should have mentioned, our teaching partnership with Kelly in North Carolina is called Be Still and Dream. It's sort of the merging of both of our studios. We have a training in Louisiana that we're doing that actually anybody is welcome to attend. You can find that information on our Instagram page as well.
What's that going to be like, the training?
So that's a 3-day training for basically it's Foundations of Kids Yoga and Mindfulness. And you leave there with a certificate of completion, and that is at Lovemore Yoga Studio in Covington, Louisiana, and they have asked us to come in. They're just sort of building their kids yoga program, and so they're opening it up to anybody that wants to learn those skills.
Okay. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah, so that's going to be really fun.
And that's coming up in the fall?
That's in July.
Oh, July. Okay.
And we actually have people coming from all over the place to do that. So if anybody wants to make the trip, it's New Orleans. So that's fun. And then, the rest of our trainings and workshops this summer are sort of in the works. So we always also are open to suggestions. So if there's something that the community really wants or needs, we just make it happen.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Mary. This was lovely.
Yes, thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank
It
you.
was really great.
It was. This was really Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. The first 3 people who leave a review will get a shout out via social media, so please leave your Instagram name. If you'd like to volunteer with Be Still Kids, sign your kids up for some of their summer programs, or take a training with Mary, all of her contact info can be found in the show notes. Also, please go give her a follow on Instagram at be.still.kids. Now, in next week's episode, we're going to put the pause on the mindfulness series because guess what? It is time to gear up for summer, and that means, drumroll please, the Ayurvedic series is back on, and this time we are talking to Angela Gaz, an Ayurvedic counselor in the Seattle area. Angela is going to give us some insight and tips on how to balance ourselves out as we come into the Pitta season. You can find Angela on Instagram at Eka Yoga Ayurveda. Until next time, let's chat on social media and please continue to love on yourself. Namaste and Shanti peace to you and your household.